When did you realize someone you loved was in danger? My sister Annalise asked me to pick her up from the airport after her month in Colombia with her creepy boyfriend Wyatt. She said Wyatt had to fly to Miami for work so she'd be alone. Annalise came through customs looking pale and sweaty, dragging a new suitcase I'd never seen before. When I hugged her, she was trembling and her shirt was soaked through with sweat. She kept looking over her shoulder at the security checkpoint, flinching every time a uniformed officer walked by. I asked if she was sick and she said she was just tired from the flight, but her eyes were darting everywhere, never meeting mine. Walking through the terminal, she insisted on pulling her suitcase herself, even though it was clearly heavy and she was struggling. When I reached for it, she actually yanked it away and snapped at me not to touch it. That wasn't like Annalise at all. She kept checking her phone obsessively, typing and deleting messages, and I caught a glimpse of Wyatt's name with about 50 missed calls underneath it. We passed the first security checkpoint and Annalise started walking faster, almost running. I had to grab her arm to slow her down because people were staring. She was muttering something about needing to get to the car right now, that we had to leave immediately. Her pupils were huge and she kept scratching at her arms like something was crawling on her skin. When I asked what was wrong, she laughed this high, manic laugh and said everything was perfect, just perfect, while tears rolled down her face. At the bathroom, she said she needed to go, but begged me to watch her suitcase and not let anyone near it. The second she was gone, I noticed the suitcase had fresh scratches all around the lock like someone had pried it open and resealed it. There was also a weird chemical smell coming from it, something sharp and wrong. A drug dog and handler walked by and the dog immediately turned toward the suitcase, pulling on its leash. The handler looked at me and I tried to act normal, but my heart was pounding. They kept walking, but the handler was talking into his radio. Annalise came back looking worse, makeup running, hands visibly shaking. She grabbed the suitcase and started speed walking toward the exit. I followed, trying to ask what Wyatt had done, but she kept saying, "He loves me, he loves me, he loves me," over and over like a prayer. More security appeared ahead of us, checking random people, and Annalise froze completely. She turned to walk the other way, but there were officers behind us too. "Did Wyatt give you anything to bring back?" I whispered, and she started crying harder. She said he'd given her a new suitcase as a gift, that hers had broken, that he'd already packed it for her as a surprise. She hadn't even looked inside it. The drug dog team was circling back toward us, the dog straining against its leash, and I realized we were being surrounded. Officers were moving to block the exits, trying to be subtle but failing. Annalise noticed too and grabbed my hand so tight it hurt. "He said if anything went wrong, I should say I don't know what's in there," she whispered. "He said to act surprised. He said they couldn't prove I knew." Her voice was getting higher, more panicked. "But there's so much of it. I could feel how heavy it was. I knew something was wrong, but I loved him and I thought." The dog was 10 feet away, pulling hard toward us. The handler was staring directly at me, hand on his radio. Other passengers were being directed around us, creating an empty circle with us in the center. Annalise was hyperventilating, saying Wyatt had promised to marry her, that he'd said this one trip would set them up for life. She kept saying she was supposed to meet him in Miami tomorrow, that he had the ring, that they were going to start fresh, but her phone showed he'd blocked her number while she was in the air. An announcement came over the loudspeaker asking passengers to remain calm and follow officer instructions. That was never good. Annalise's legs gave out and I had to hold her up. She was whispering about prison, about how she couldn't go to prison, about how mom would never forgive her. The dog was barking now, loud and aggressive, straining toward the suitcase. I could see at least 12 officers converging on our position, hands on their weapons. Annalise looked at me with pure terror in her eyes. "They execute people for this in some countries," she whispered. "Wyatt told me that like it was a fun fact. He knew what he was doing to me." She started laughing again, that same manic sound, saying Wyatt probably never even went to Miami, that he was probably already in another country with another girl, packing another suitcase. The dog lunged at the suitcase, barking frantically. Officers rushed us from all sides, screaming commands. Annalise grabbed my arm and pulled me close. "He said it was just jewelry," she said, her voice dead. "I knew he was lying, but I brought it anyway because I thought he loved me." The officers reached us, weapons drawn, shouting for us to get on the ground. My knees hit the cold tile hard as 12 officers screamed at us to get down, and I pressed my cheek against the grimy airport floor, while Annalise collapsed beside me like her bones had turned to water. The officers moved fast, one knee pressing into my back while metal cuffs clicked around my wrists, and I kept saying I was just picking up my sister, but nobody was listening. Annalise went completely limp, not even crying anymore, just staring at nothing while they cuffed her too, and I tried to turn my head to see her, but the officer's hand pushed me back down. They pulled me to my feet first, my shoulders screaming from the weird angle, and I watched them try to get Annalise up, but she couldn't stand. Her legs just wouldn't work. Two officers had to basically carry her to a bench while I got marched in the opposite direction, and she looked back at me with eyes so empty it made my stomach twist. The EMTs showed up within minutes, their medical bags hitting the floor as they rushed to Annalise, who was gasping like she couldn't get air, and they got an oxygen mask on her face while she was still cuffed. I could hear them talking about her heart rate being way too high, something about possible shock, and I tried to go to her, but the officers kept me sitting against a wall 20 feet away where I could only watch. The drug dog was going crazy at the suitcase now, barking and lunging while its handler held it back, and another officer in gloves started opening the suitcase right there in the middle of the terminal. Even from where I sat, I could see the wrapped packages tucked under Annalise's clothes, brick-shaped things wrapped in plastic and tape, and that chemical smell got so strong several people walking by started coughing. The officer opening the case whistled low and said something about this being huge, bigger than anything they'd seen in months, while another one started taking photos from every angle. A woman in a dark suit walked over to me, her badge hanging from her neck, and she introduced herself as Agent Rosanna Cobb from the DEA, her voice professional but not mean, as she explained they had to process both of us even though she could already tell I probably wasn't involved. She said the amount in that suitcase was enough for serious federal charges, mandatory minimums, the kind of time that ruins lives, and my my hands started shaking even though I hadn't done anything wrong. Agent Cobb pulled up a chair and asked me to explain everything about Wyatt and the Colombia trip, and I hesitated because talking felt like betraying Annalise, but staying quiet might make everything worse for both of us. I told her about the 50 missed calls I'd seen on Annalise's phone, how Wyatt had blocked her number while she was flying, how they'd spent a whole month together in Colombia, and she'd been so happy in her texts until today. Agent Cobb wrote everything down in a small notebook, asking follow-up questions about how long they'd been dating, where they met, if I'd noticed any warning signs before, and I answered as best I could while watching the EMTS work on my sister. I asked if I could call a lawyer, and Agent Cobb said that was absolutely my right, but also mentioned that cooperation might help Annalise's case, especially if she really was a victim here. My fingers fumbled with my phone as I searched for federal defense attorneys, scrolling through reviews until I found someone named Alistair Grove who seemed to know what he was doing. And when I called his office, they said he could meet us at the federal building in 2 hours. The EMTs had Annalise on a gurney now, the oxygen mask still on her face, and I watched as officers read her rights while she sat there nodding weakly at their questions about whether she understood. Her eyes were completely vacant, like she'd gone somewhere else in her mind, somewhere safer than this nightmare. And when they helped her stand to walk to the transport vehicle, she moved like a robot. They took me to a different vehicle, not arrested, but not free either, and drove me to the federal building downtown where everything was concrete and bulletproof glass. The holding area they put me in had uncomfortable plastic chairs and flickering lights, and I sat there for 3 hours watching the clock and trying not to think about what was happening to Annalise. Through a reinforced window, I could see into another room where they were processing her, taking her fingerprints, photographing her from different angles, and the reality that my sister was booked on federal drug charges made me want to throw up. Other people in the holding area kept their distance, probably sensing I was radioactive with whatever trouble had brought me here, and I just sat there replaying everything, wondering how we'd gotten to this point. Alistair Grove finally showed up looking tired but alert, his suit slightly wrinkled like he'd been working all day already, and he immediately asked for somewhere private where we could talk. I'm trying to understand how Wyatt planned this whole thing. Did he pick Colombia specifically because he knew about the drug routes there? The way Annalise kept saying, "He loves me," over and over, makes me wonder if that was something he trained her. The guards led us to a small room with a metal table and plastic chairs, and Alistair sat down across from me, pulling out a yellow legal pad and expensive-looking pen. He explained that with the amount they found, Annalise was looking at a mandatory minimum of 10 years, unless we could prove she was coerced or genuinely didn't know what was in the suitcase, and then he said something that gave me a tiny bit of hope. Wyatt's disappearance actually helped our case because it showed a clear pattern of exploitation, of using women and then abandoning them to take the fall, and if we could prove that pattern, we might be able to get the charges reduced or even dropped. The meeting with Alistair ended around midnight, and I drove home in a daze, barely remembering the route. I couldn't sleep that night, just kept checking my phone and reading about federal drug charges online until my eyes burned. The next morning, I got to the courthouse at 7, even though Annalise's hearing wasn't until 9. The federal building felt huge and cold with metal detectors everywhere and guards who looked right through you. I found the right courtroom and sat in the hard wooden bench in the gallery, watching other cases go first. Drug dealers, fraud cases, people in orange jumpsuits shuffling in with chains around their ankles. Then they brought Annalise in wearing the same orange jumpsuit, and I had to bite my lip to keep from crying. She looked smaller somehow, her hair flat against her head, no makeup, dark circles under her eyes. The federal magistrate barely looked up from his papers while the prosecutor talked about the amount of drugs they found, using words like trafficking and distribution. She mentioned flight risk since Annalise had just come from Colombia and had connections there through Wyatt. Alistair tried arguing that Annalise had no criminal record, that she was a victim, but the judge cut him off and ordered her held without bail pending a detention hearing. The whole thing took maybe 10 minutes, and then they were leading Annalise away again, her chains clanking with each step. That afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and a woman named Safia Zamora introduced herself, saying she ran a victim advocacy group that Alistair had contacted. She explained how she'd seen this pattern dozens of times. Boyfriends who take women to foreign countries, isolate them, then use them as drug mules. She described Wyatt's tactics like she'd met him, the way he'd probably showered Annalise with attention at first, then slowly cut her off from friends and family. The gift suitcase was classic, she said, giving the woman no chance to check what's inside before going through security. 2 days later, Alistair called saying prosecutor Yvette Pearson wanted to meet about the charges. Her office was all dark wood and law books, diplomas on the walls, pictures of her shaking hands with important-looking people. She listened while Alistair explained about Wyatt's manipulation, nodding occasionally but not giving anything away. When he finished, she leaned back and said she understood this wasn't a typical case, but without Wyatt in custody or solid proof Annalise didn't know about the drugs, she was still looking at 10 years minimum mandatory. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I spent the next 3 days at my apartment going through every backup of Annalise's phone I could find on her laptop, scrolling through thousands of texts and messages. The pattern was right there in black and white. Messages from 6 months ago where Wyatt convinced her to skip her friend's birthday party to spend time with him instead. Texts where he got mad when she went out without him. Screenshots she'd sent me asking if his jealousy was normal, if it meant he really loved her. Then the messages got worse. Him convincing her to quit her job for the Colombia trip, promising he'd take care of everything. Him sending her money for bills but only enough to keep her dependent, never enough to save anything. Each message made my hands shake harder with anger at how he'd planned this whole thing. Agent Cobb came to my apartment with Annalise's actual phone, which the DEA had been analyzing. She suggested we try reaching out to Wyatt through Annalise's social media accounts to see if he'd respond. We sat at my kitchen table crafting a message that sounded desperate enough to be real, saying Annalise was scared and needed him, begging him to help her. Agent Cobb typed it on Annalise's phone while recording everything on her DEA device. We sent it through Instagram, WhatsApp, WhatsApp, even Facebook, then waited. An hour later, Agent Cobb's phone buzzed with a notification that someone had viewed the Instagram message but didn't respond. She tried calling the number Wyatt had been using, putting it on speaker so we could both hear. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail, his voice casual and friendly like he was some normal guy, not someone who'd destroyed my sister's life. Agent Cobb left a message from Annalise's phone begging him to call back while she recorded everything on a second device. She explained that guys like Wyatt usually ditch their phones within days, but the voicemail itself was evidence of the number being active. A week later, Alistair called me excited, saying the DEA had found something important in the airport security footage. I met him at his office where he pulled up a grainy video on his computer. There was Wyatt at the check-in counter, handling a silver suitcase that looked exactly like the one Annalise got arrested with. The timestamp showed him checking it in himself, then handing it to Annalise as they walked toward security. You could see him pointing at something, probably telling her to keep it safe, then kissing her cheek before splitting off toward a different gate. The forensic analyst had matched scratches on the suitcase in the video to the one seized from Annalise. More evidence came from Annalise's credit card records that Alistair subpoenaed. Every single charge in Colombia was from Wyatt's card, not hers. Hotels, restaurants, even the pharmacy where she bought tampons, all paid by him. The forensic accountant Alistair hired said this showed complete financial control, that Wyatt had made her totally dependent on him during the trip. There were even charges for clothes shopping where he'd bought her entire new outfits, probably so she'd have to leave her own things behind. 3 weeks after the arrest, I finally got to visit Annalise in federal detention. The visiting room had thick glass between us and phones that smelled like disinfectant. She looked better than at the hearing, more like herself, but her eyes kept darting around like she expected Wyatt to appear. She started telling me things she hadn't said before, how he'd scream at her in Colombia if she questioned anything, how he'd threatened to leave her there with no money or passport. She described him grabbing her arm hard enough to leave bruises when she suggested they skip a meeting with his friends, but then she'd stop mid-sentence and defend him, saying maybe she misunderstood, maybe he was just stressed about work. Meanwhile, my boss kept calling about when I'd be back in the office full-time. I'd burned through 2 weeks of vacation, then started using FMLA time, but that was running out too. HR sent emails about unpaid leave policies while my supervisor left voicemails about important projects falling behind. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize, and when I opened it, my hands started shaking because it said I needed to stop talking to the feds if I wanted to stay safe. The message mentioned my apartment building by name and the exact floor I worked on at my company, and even knew what color car I drove. I took a screenshot right away and forwarded it to Agent Cobb, who called me back within 2 minutes telling me to come to the federal building immediately. When I got there, she had already printed out the message and was on the phone with someone about tracing the number, but she said these guys usually used burner phones. She arranged for local police to drive by my apartment 3 times a day and check the parking garage at my work, and told me Wyatt probably had people who didn't want Annalise cooperating. I started taking different routes to work every day and checking under my car before getting in and looking in the back seat, and even varying what time I left the office. 3 days later, Yvette Pearson called Alistair about a possible cooperation agreement where if Annalise could give them useful information about Wyatt's operation, they might reduce the charges significantly. Alistair met with me that afternoon and explained this was our best chance at getting her less than the mandatory minimum sentence, but she'd have to deliver real intelligence, not just stories about their relationship. The DEA's technical team had been analyzing Wyatt's travel records and discovered he'd made the Colombia to Miami route 6 times in the past year, and each time he traveled with a different woman who flew back alone. Agent Cobb showed me the flight manifests with all these women's names highlighted and said we'd uncovered a clear pattern of him using girlfriends as unwitting mules over and over. She had an idea about using Annalise's Instagram account to post about missing Wyatt and wanting to see him to see if any of his associates would reach out. I logged into Annalise's account from the federal building while Agent Cobb watched and posted a photo of them together with a caption about how much I missed him and hoped he'd contact me soon. Within 4 hours, someone messaged the account claiming to be Wyatt's friend and saying they could arrange a meeting if I really wanted to see him. Agent Cobb got excited and said this could be our chance to get someone from his network, so we set up the meeting for a coffee shop downtown the next afternoon. How did the DEA tech team find all those other women on the flight records? The way they tracked Wyatt's pattern with 6 different girlfriends is like solving a puzzle where each piece shows the same terrible trick repeated over and over. The morning of the meeting, 2 agents fitted me with a wire that went under my shirt, and they coached me on what questions to ask to draw out information without seeming suspicious. My heart was pounding as I sat in the coffee shop with agents stationed at nearby tables and outside on the street pretending to be regular customers. A young guy walked up to the coffee shop entrance and stopped to look through the window and scan the room before immediately turning around and walking away fast. The agents tried to follow him, but he went straight into the subway station during rush hour and disappeared into the crowd before anyone could catch up. Agent Cobb reviewed the security footage later and said he must have spotted something that spooked him, like maybe he recognized one of the undercover agents from somewhere else. 2 weeks went by with no new leads until another woman got arrested at the same airport with an identical silver suitcase and the exact same story about her boyfriend sending her back from Colombia alone. She told the agents her boyfriend's name was Tyler, but when they showed her Wyatt's photo, she identified him immediately, and the details matched everything Annalise had said. This second arrest proved Wyatt was running an organized operation and gave us more evidence for Annalise's defense that she was just one of many victims. Sofia Zamora arranged for a forensic psychologist to evaluate Annalise through the Victim Advocacy Program to document the psychological manipulation she'd experienced. The psychologist spent 3 sessions with Annalise in detention and wrote a detailed report about trauma bonding and coercive control and how Wyatt had systematically broken down her independence and judgment over their months together. The evaluation described specific techniques Wyatt used, like love bombing, at first, then isolation, then financial control, then threats of abandonment that matched textbook domestic abuse patterns. This professional assessment became crucial evidence for the defense, showing Annalise wasn't just some willing drug smuggler, but a victim of calculated psychological manipulation. The detention review hearing finally came up on the calendar, and even though the judge kept the no-bail order in place, he did approve transferring Annalise to a facility with better mental health services. The new place had actual therapy programs and psychiatric care instead of just basic medical, and Annalise would get proper treatment for the trauma while serving her pretrial detention. It wasn't freedom, but after seeing her deteriorate in regular detention, this felt like a huge victory, and I actually cried with relief in the courtroom. Alistair said this was a good sign that the judge recognized Annalise needed help, not just punishment, and it might influence the eventual sentencing too. 3 days later, I drove to the new facility with the letter-writing supplies Alistair had suggested bringing, since they had strict rules about what could come in. The place looked more like a hospital than a jail, with actual grass and windows you could see through, and Annalise was waiting in a visiting room that had regular chairs instead of bolted-down metal. She looked better already, with color back in her face and her hands steady as she took the legal pad and started writing what Alistair needed for the court. The first draft kept saying things like maybe Wyatt didn't mean it, or he was probably scared too, but I sat there quietly while she crumpled it up and started over. The second draft was angrier, but still made excuses for him, saying the pressure of his lifestyle made him do bad things, and I watched her tear that one up too. Finally, on the third try, she wrote clearly that Wyatt had lied to her and used her and put her in danger for his own profit, and when she signed it, her hand was firm and steady. Alistair picked it up that afternoon and filed it immediately with the court as evidence she was breaking free from his influence. While I was packing up Annalise's stuff from the Colombia trip to put in storage, I found this tiny key in a jewelry pouch Wyatt had given her with some cheap earrings. It wasn't a regular key, but one of those small padlock ones, and when I showed it to Agent Cobb the next morning, she got excited and said it looked like a storage unit key. Within 2 hours, she had a warrant, and we were driving to a storage facility on the edge of town, where their records showed a unit rented under one of Wyatt's fake names. My stomach felt sick as we walked down the row of units, thinking about what we might find, and Agent Cobb had backup agents with her just in case. The key worked, and when they rolled up the door, I saw stacks of empty suitcases identical to the one Annalise got caught with, plus boxes of packaging materials and vacuum sealers. There were also folders with travel documents for at least 6 different women, including copies of passports and flight itineraries, all for the Colombia route. Agent Cobb took photos of everything while another agent cataloged it all, and she kept saying this was exactly what they needed to prove the pattern of trafficking. The packaging materials matched the chemical smell from Annalise's suitcase perfectly, and there were even practice runs showing how to pack the drugs to avoid detection. 2 weeks after finding the storage unit, Alistair called to say Yvette Pearson wanted to meet about a possible plea deal based on all the new evidence. At the meeting, she wasn't as harsh as before, and actually acknowledged that Annalise had been exploited by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. She offered to reduce the charges to simple possession with a recommendation for downward departure, recognizing Annalise as a victim of trafficking. Alistair told me quietly, this was better than we could have hoped for 2 months ago, when they were talking about 20 years minimum. That night my phone rang, and it was Mom calling for the first time since the arrest, and I thought maybe she was finally ready to support Annalise. Instead, she started yelling at me for enabling Annalise and hiring lawyers and not letting her face the consequences of trusting some criminal boyfriend. She said Annalise made her choice, and I was just making excuses for her bad decisions and wasting money on lawyers when Annalise deserved whatever she got. I hung up on her mid-sentence and decided right then that I needed boundaries with family members who couldn't see that Annalise was a victim, not a criminal. The next morning at work, I noticed people whispering when I walked by, and my coworker showed me a news article about a major drug bust at the airport, though they didn't use names yet. The article mentioned 2 sisters being arrested, and anyone who knew me would figure out it was us, and I spent the whole day feeling people staring and wondering what they were thinking. My supervisor pulled me aside to ask if everything was okay, and I could tell she'd seen the article too, but I just said I was dealing with a family situation and needed to focus on work. During my weekly call with Annalise, she suddenly got angry at me for the first time since this all started. She said maybe I didn't understand Wyatt's situation, and maybe he had reasons for what he did, and we were ruining his life by cooperating with the DEA. I took a deep breath and reminded her calmly that he'd abandoned her to face federal prison alone while he ran away and blocked her number. She went quiet for a long moment, then said I was right, but I could hear in her voice she was still conflicted about him. Agent Cobb called the next day to admit they were having trouble finding Wyatt because he'd probably left the country using fake documents. She said resources were being shifted to other cases, though they'd keep his file open, but realistically he might never face justice for what he did. The anger I felt was overwhelming, but I tried to focus on what we could control, which was helping Annalise get through this. Alistair filed a motion to exclude Annalise's panicked statements at the airport, arguing she was in medical distress and hadn't been properly read her rights yet. He said it was a long shot, but every little bit helped in negotiating with the prosecutor, and the judge scheduled a hearing to consider the motion. Then the crime lab report came in, showing multiple fingerprints on the suitcase lock, including prints that matched the storage unit but didn't belong to Annalise at all. There were at least 3 other people's prints on that lock, proving others had handled the drugs before she ever touched the suitcase, and Alistair actually smiled when he showed me the report, calling it the smoking gun we'd been hoping for. Agent Cobb called 2 days later with news that made my stomach drop. She'd been digging through federal databases and discovered Wyatt had been using at least 3 different names across multiple states. One of his aliases popped up in connection with a similar case in Texas, where another woman got caught at the border with a suitcase she didn't pack. The pattern was bigger than we thought, possibly interstate, which meant they were bringing in additional federal resources to track him down. Finally, we had some real momentum in actually eventually finding this guy who'd destroyed my sister's life. The next morning, Yvette circulated a draft cooperation agreement that spelled out exactly what Annalise needed to provide in exchange for the reduced sentence. The document was 12 pages long and included requirements for full disclosure about the Colombia trip, testimony if they caught Wyatt, and participation in victim counseling programs. Alistair went through every single word with a highlighter, making notes in the margins and calling me 3 times to discuss specific clauses. He wanted to make sure we understood exactly what we were agreeing to before Annalise signed anything. A week later, we all gathered at the federal building for Annalise's formal proffer session, where she had to detail everything about how Wyatt recruited her. The fingerprints on that lock tell such an interesting story. 3 different people handled it before Annalise ever touched the suitcase. That makes me wonder about the whole chain of how Wyatt's operation worked, like who were these other people and what roles did they play in moving the drugs around. She sat at a long table with prosecutors on one side and us on the other, while a court reporter typed every word. For 6 hours straight, Annalise talked about meeting Wyatt at a coffee shop, how he slowly isolated her from friends, convinced her to quit her job, and promised her a future together. She broke down crying 4 different times, especially when describing how he'd get angry if she questioned anything or threatened to leave her alone in Colombia if she didn't do what he said. The prosecutors kept pushing for more details, more specifics, more examples of his control. By the end, Annalise was exhausted and shaking, but she'd gotten through it all. The prosecutors seemed satisfied with her cooperation and said they'd move forward with the plea agreement. 3 weeks passed before the change of plea hearing, where Annalise would officially plead guilty to the lesser charge. Standing in that courtroom, she had to admit guilt out loud, which was harder than anything else so far. Her voice cracked when she said yes, she understood the charges, and yes, she was pleading guilty voluntarily. The judge acknowledged all the evidence of coercion we'd submitted and said he would consider a downward departure at sentencing based on her being a victim of manipulation. We were looking at years instead of decades now, which felt like a victory even though any prison time was terrifying. Meanwhile, I'd been missing so much work for court appearances and lawyer meetings that my boss called me in for a serious conversation. I'd burned through all my vacation days and FMLA time, and they were talking about putting me on unpaid leave. The stress of possibly losing my job on top of everything else was crushing, but I couldn't abandon Annalise now. After 2 days of negotiation, I finally worked out a part-time remote arrangement that would let me keep my health insurance while managing all these legal obligations. It meant less money, but the flexibility was essential for getting through this. My supervisor seemed relieved to find a solution that kept me on staff since I'd been a good employee for 5 years before this nightmare started. The court approved a formal no-contact order the following week, preventing Wyatt or any of his associates from contacting Annalise or me. It felt like closing a door on that threat, even though we both knew it was just paper if someone really wanted to hurt us. Still, having something official we could point to if anything happened made us both sleep a little better. Both sides submitted their sentencing memorandums 2 weeks before the sentencing date. Alistair's filing included the psychological evaluation showing trauma bonding, evidence of manipulation from the Colombia trip, and letters from Safia's victim advocacy group explaining how women get trapped in these situations. I spent 3 nights writing my own letter about the sister I knew before Wyatt, the smart and independent woman who'd been turned into a victim by a predator. Even Yvette acknowledged in her filing that Annalise had been exploited, though she maintained my sister still bore some responsibility for bringing drugs into the country. The sentencing day arrived with me sitting in the gallery trying not to throw up from nerves. The judge reviewed all the evidence, all the arguments, all the documentation of Wyatt's manipulation. After what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes, he granted the downward variance, sentencing Annalise to 18 months in a residential drug treatment program, followed by 3 years of supervised release. It wasn't perfect, but it meant treatment instead of hard prison time. Annalise started crying with relief, and I did too, not caring who saw. They transferred her to the residential facility that same afternoon, a minimum security place that focused on rehabilitation instead of punishment. After months in federal detention, seeing her walk into a place with gardens and windows felt like a miracle. She'd have therapy, job training, and eventually weekend passes to rebuild her life. Our first family session at the treatment center happened a week later, awkward but necessary. The counselor helped us set boundaries and expectations for moving forward. I made it clear I'd support her recovery, but wouldn't enable any backsliding or contact with anyone from Wyatt's world. Annalise agreed, seeming more like herself than she had in months, actually making eye contact and speaking in complete sentences instead of the broken fragments we'd gotten used to. 2 weeks passed before Agent Cobb called me at work with news that made me drop my coffee mug. One of Wyatt's recruiters got arrested in Florida trying to send another woman to Colombia with an identical setup. The guy was talking to save himself and confirming everything about how Wyatt operated his whole system. It wasn't Wyatt himself, but the net was getting tighter, and more people knew his methods now. I called Alistair immediately, and he said this was huge for showing the pattern went beyond just Annalise. The next day, Yvette called to confirm that Annalise had met all her cooperation requirements and wouldn't need to testify unless they actually caught Wyatt. This meant she could focus on getting better without worrying about being dragged back to court every few weeks. We could finally look forward instead of constantly checking over our shoulders for the next legal problem. I drove to the treatment center that weekend to help Annalise with all the paperwork for starting fresh. We sat at a plastic table in the common room filling out forms for new bank accounts that had no connection to her old life. The bank lady was patient while Annalise's hands shook, signing all the signature cards. Then we went to the phone store where she picked a new number with a different area code from before. She deleted all her social media accounts right there in the store, watching years of photos disappear without crying. When her new driver's license arrived 2 weeks later with the treatment center address on it, she actually smiled. The counselor pulled me aside during my next visit to say Annalise was doing really well in group therapy. She'd started mentoring newer residents who'd been through similar stuff with boyfriends, using them as as mules. Watching her help a crying 19-year-old understand she wasn't stupid for trusting someone she loved was powerful. The counselor said turning her trauma into something helpful was a really good sign for recovery. I visited every Sunday and could see real changes in how she carried herself now. Her shoulders weren't hunched anymore, and she made eye contact when talking instead of staring at the floor. She was gaining weight back and her skin looked healthier without all the stress. Meanwhile, I was falling apart from months of constant crisis mode and finally made myself call a therapist. The first session, I just cried for 40 minutes while she handed me tissues and waited. She helped me understand that watching your sister go through this kind of trauma affects you too. We worked through my anger at Wyatt that had nowhere to go since he was still free somewhere. The guilt about not seeing the warning signs earlier took longer to process but got easier. After a few weeks, I could actually sleep through the night without waking up in panic about what might happen next. Annalise surprised me one Sunday by showing me her laptop with online college enrollment forms pulled up. The treatment center had a program where residents could take classes, and she wanted to study criminal justice. She said understanding the system that prosecuted her but also protected her would help her make sense of everything. Her first semester, she took just 2 classes but got A's in both and seemed genuinely excited about the reading. The professor even commented on her discussion posts about how personal experience gave her unique insights. On a rainy Saturday, we tackled the storage unit where I'd thrown all her stuff from before the trip. Opening those boxes felt like looking at artifacts from a different person's life. We sorted through clothes she'd never wear again, and jewelry Wyatt had given her with fake promises attached. Each piece went in the donation pile or straight to the trash, especially that necklace he gave her for their 6-month anniversary. She held each item for a second before letting it go, not crying but not smiling either. We kept her college textbooks from before she dropped out to travel with him, and photos from family trips when we were kids. The stuff that reminded her of who she was before him and who she was becoming now stayed. Everything connected to that nightmare year went away. 3 months into the treatment program, the change was obvious to everyone who knew her. She was stable enough to have unsupervised phone privileges and even got approved for day passes. The nightmares had mostly stopped and she could talk about what happened without completely breaking down. Wyatt was still out there somewhere, but law enforcement knew his methods and other women were being warned. We'd learned to live with that incomplete justice and focus on protecting other potential victims instead. When people asked about that day at the airport, I told them it was the worst day that led to her finally getting free. Thanks for tagging along while I wondered and explored today. Always a blast hanging out with you. I'll see you soon in the next one. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.